Hello, hi, welcome once again to M5's English language learning program, Let's Speak English. I'm Gav Duncan and I'm here on your TV to help you learn English. Now, are you sitting comfortably? Yes? Good. And are you ready for today's lesson? Yes? Good. Okay. Well, let's learn English together. And welcome to the show. You're looking very good today. You look like you slept well, had a good breakfast, enjoyed your morning, had something fantastic for lunch, had a great start to the afternoon, and are now relaxed and ready, with your brain buzzing like a chainsaw, ready to carve through some more English. Am I right? I think I am. So, you're all ready, and I'm all ready. The crew is all ready, and Chobber, the man with the cans, is ready. He's always ready. So, tell Margot the cat to get off the sofa. Tell Goosty the dog to eat his food quietly and then lie down. Take a sip of your coffee or tea. Take a bite of your chocolate biscuit, and let's get stuck in to today's lesson. Now, what have we been looking at for the past couple of weeks? Do you remember? Of course you remember. Gods of English don't forget things like that. Okay, so that means that we all know that for the past couple of weeks we've been looking again at the idea of obligation. We looked at the idea of strong obligation. We looked at two forms in English that we use to communicate the idea of strong obligation. Have to and must. Okay, all clear on the Western Front. Good. Now, today, we're going to look at some more ways of expressing obligation in English. Are you ready? Yes? Good, because here we go. Okay. Now, we know how to express strong obligation. We know how to tell someone that something is necessary, that they need to do it, that they must do it, that they have to do it. But sometimes we don't want to use a strong form of obligation. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. Okay, so what form can we use to talk about a mild obligation, something which isn't a strong obligation? Well, when we want to talk about mild obligation, we use two terms in English, should and ought to. Now, these two mean almost exactly the same thing, but they're very different from what we learned before. Must and have to are strong obligation. We use must and have to when we're talking about necessity, when we're saying that something is needed, something is required. When you're driving, for example, you are required to wear a seatbelt. It is necessary. You have to do it. You must wear a seatbelt. It's the law. There is very strong obligation here. When we use should and when we use ought to, it's really another way of saying it's a good idea. It's the right thing to do. We use should and ought to give advice. Now, this means that we can use should and ought to in different ways. Firstly, we can use these two to talk about obligation, mild obligation. You should brush your teeth every morning when you get up and every night before you go to bed. And we can say exactly the same thing using ought to. You ought to brush your teeth every morning when you get up and every night before you go to bed. Now, sometimes we can see that should is communicating the idea of mild obligation. But most of the time, the difference between mild obligation and giving advice is very, very small. If we say, for example, you should see a doctor about your leg, or if we say you ought to see a doctor about your leg, we can say that these sentences are communicating mild obligation. But at the same time, we can also say that these sentences are just giving advice. One friend is telling another friend that it's a good idea to see a doctor about their leg. So, we can use should and ought to communicate mild obligation, advice, and saying what we think is a good idea. And most of the time, the three meanings, obligation, advice, and it's a good idea, get mixed up with each other, and we don't know which one is which. This is not a problem. They're very similar to each other. Okay, now let's have a look at the form of these two. Well, let's start with the positive version of should. Should is easy. We start with a subject. I, you, Dave, Chief Mangasutu Buthelezi. Then we add the word should, and then follow it with a verb in the infinitive without to. We should get Mabel to show us all of that in one of her famous tables. Mabel, Mabel, enable, disable, fable, sable, label, table. Thank you, it's my latest poem. Okay, well, that's simple enough, isn't it? Yes, that's not very difficult at all. We start with a subject, like we normally do. Then we just throw in the word should, and then follow should with a verb in the infinitive without to. Simple. Okay, so what's next? Well, what do we normally learn next? First of all, we learn the positive, and then we start to move in the opposite direction. And so, it's now time to look at the negative. Now, the negative form for should is just as simple as the positive. But what is the negative form of should? Well, which word do we always see when we talk about negatives? That's right. The word we always see is not. And it's the same here. We use the word not to make the negative. Should becomes should not. Or, because we always prefer to use the short version, the abbreviated form, shouldn't. Okay, so the negative form of should is should not or shouldn't. Okay, so how do we put together a negative sentence? Well, we make a negative sentence with should in exactly the same way as we make positive sentences with should. Just like with the positive, we start with a subject, then add not should, but the negative version, shouldn't. After that, just as we did with the positive version, we follow it with a verb in the infinitive without to. Okay. So that means that it's very simple to use should in both the positive and negative forms. Okay, so what do you think we're going to look at next? Well, we've seen the positive and negative forms of should. What's next? Well, what if we want to ask a question with should? Then what do? Well, let's think about how we normally ask questions. What normally happens to the word order? Can anyone remember? That's right. When we make a question in English, the word order changes. Just think about it for a moment. If we take an everyday, normal, positive statement like Zhuji, the brush, thinks Michael Dudikoff is sexier than Yoda, then what do? What do we change to turn that statement into a question? Well, the first thing is the easiest thing. If we're asking a question, we know that we need to put a question mark at the end of everything. Simple. Okay, but what else do we have to do? Well, when we make a question in English, we have to change the word order. The verb comes in front of the subject. That means that when we want to change the statement into a question, we have to change the places of the subject and the verb. Okay. Now, in our example sentence, Zhuji, the brush, thinks Michael Dudikoff is sexier than Yoda. Where's the subject and where's the verb? Well, that's easy, isn't it? That's not a difficult task for a god of English, is it? The subject is what? That's right. The subject of the sentence is Zhuji, the brush. Good. Now what about the verb? Which word is the verb? That's right again. 10 out of 10. In our example sentence, the verb is think. And because the subject in the sentence is Zhuji, the brush, we're talking about the third person singular. Okay. And what do we remember about the third person singular? That's correct, a-doodle-doo. When we make a sentence with the third person singular in the present simple, we have to add something to most verbs, don't we? Okay. What do we have to add? Does anyone remember? That's right. When we make a sentence with the third person singular in the present tense, we have to add an S to most verbs. I read, you read, but he reads, she reads, and it reads. Remember? So in our example sentence, we can see that we don't use think, but thinks, because the subject we're using, Zhuji, the brush, is she, the third person singular. Okay, now, back to making the question. So, we've correctly identified the subject and the verb, and we know that when we make a question, we have to change the order of the subject and the verb. So we start the question with the verb. But how do we ask questions in the present simple? There's something else we need to think about, isn't there? Yes. How do we ask questions in the present simple? There's something else we need, isn't there? Yes. We need what? Who remembers? Yes. Bolázs from the corner of the main road and Szabadság utca in Balaton-Szemes. You're right, Bolázs, you're not wrong. We need an auxiliary verb. We need a verb to help us ask questions and make negative sentences in the present simple. Is it all starting to come back to you? Does any of this ring a bell? Well, I hope it's all coming back to you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So, that means two things. Firstly, you've all got some extra time to refresh your memories about asking questions in the present simple in English. And secondly, Enid's gonna kill me. I heard her come in earlier, and now I'm going to have to find her and tell her that there's no time for her section today. Oh dear. I hope Keith's not with her. I saw what Rupert looked like after Keith pecked his face. It wasn't pretty. I took a picture with my phone. Look. See? It's so horrific. The TV people have censored it. Terrible. Okay, well, I suppose I'd better go and break the bad news to Enid. God, I hope she's left Keith at home. He's a psychopath. Okay, I'm off. If I'm not in hospital tomorrow, I'll see you then, and we'll carry on with the question form in the present simple. Hope to see you tomorrow. Bye.